I'm not going to take very long because I know you're all interested in getting right to the heart of our presentation tonight, but I would like to welcome you on behalf of CIUT. We're very happy to see you all here tonight. And in thinking about what I was going to say just to introduce us tonight, it occurred to me that it takes a lot of courage to put a presentation like this on. Courage for you to be here, to challenge your established ideals, to swim against the current of mainstream thought, and perhaps get some information that may be hard to believe, but we thank you for believing in alternative thought and the value of alternative discourse. It's also, of course, a challenge for the Undercurrents Collective, about whom I'll speak in a moment. It's a financially risky venture anytime you put something like this on. You're never quite sure how it works out, but from the number of people here tonight, I'm really happy to say that it looks like it's going to be a success. And I'm sure this will be a great encouragement to Undercurrents and to CIUT to continue to bring you events like this. So hopefully you were at John Judge. If you weren't, welcome tonight. And hopefully after tonight there'll be more events that you can all tell your friends about, and we can keep this momentum going, because I think it's really excellent and really very positive. The Undercurrents Collective is a group that works out of CIUT, and they seem to be branching out as well onto television. They are a group that's dedicated to social change. They're a number of very committed volunteers who have worked very, very hard to put this on tonight, and who present some of the most provocative spoken word programming available on radio anywhere, we think. And we're very proud to have them as part of the station, and certainly they're doing the station very proud tonight by putting on an event of this quality. I would like to mention some of them by name. Steve Salgado, Leah Davis, Patrick Williams, Jenny Boutsiadis, John Wharton, and there are others. And we are very grateful for their efforts tonight in bringing this event to you, and also the programming that they do year-round. The person that I didn't mention is the person who will be speaking to you next, and I would like you to join me in welcoming one of the key members of our spoken word team at CIUT, and certainly a key member of Undercurrents, Hans Bergschmidt.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you all for coming here. It's, again, very encouraging to see the response. To see that you come here is a sign to me that you care about these issues. That's why I do the radio that I do. It's because I care. It's important to be heard. I feel like I'm an ordinary person like you, just shouting a little louder because I can work behind a radio transmitter, but I know we all have to band together to create a critical mass with this type of information and raise our consciousness, so that the kinds of activities that John will be speaking about will not be possible anymore. I again like to thank a lot of people for making this happen, especially Steve Salgado, who was the key man behind making this all happen. Also McLean Hunter, the work of Mark Sermon, who is behind these cameras here, has really been instrumental in getting Undercurrents on McLean Hunter television. We recently had a metro-wide broadcast, and apparently all the cable companies, the phone lines were busy for an hour and a half of people phoning up saying, "What was that?" They had quite a good taste of John Judge, and it's my pleasure to tell you that John Judge will be airing metro-wide again on all cable channels except Etobicoke on 3 p.m. on November the 9th and November the 16th, and that will be a 3-hour special both of those days. Do watch, do videotape it, tell your friends. A few other things I wanted to tell you about. There's a new group coming up called the Network for Media Access, which is really important to me. A group of committed media workers working in alternative media want to get together to talk to each other, band together, and see what we can do to develop a very large-scale alternative media network, to get access to media, to make our own media. And you'll be hearing more about that in the near future. Tapes are available in the foyer. Books are available in the foyer, John's books. I think they're almost sold out. And you can get them at the intermission. Put your name on the mailing list, too, when you're there. I have an announcement to make for all dedicated Undercurrents listeners. And it's with some sadness that I have to announce that Undercurrents is going off the air. We are going to be doing about 2 more shows, and the reason that this is happening is simply because it's very hard on us to stay up all night, and we want to develop our level of programming and do much more documentary type work, and I'm sure it will be resurrected with the efforts of CIUT in a more prime time, daytime slot. So that's about it for my announcements. Now, John Stockwell. I was getting some notes together to get ready to introduce John, and I can almost do this in my sleep now because I'm sick of saying these things. John Stockwell, the highest-ranking CIA officer ever to go I sort of, right from the beginning, I didn't like the tone, and I can imagine how John feels like after 600 lectures, he's the CIA guy. And I got bored with hearing it, so I thought after meeting John last night and spending some time today with him, I'd sort of like to give it a little different slant. We all know where he's coming from, right? We all know that he was in the CIA, and that was a long time ago. What I see now is a very human being that has gone through a lot of struggle within himself and a lot of pain to try and understand why things go on in the world. He searches to understand why we put up barriers amongst ourselves, barriers that are so cold and hard that we would kill each other over these barriers. Not only kill each other, but kill entire populations. So I'd like to introduce John Stockwell, the humanist, the peace worker, and a man who is dedicated to helping us live together in peace on this planet, John Stockwell.
Thank you for this wonderful turnout and for inviting me. And especially I want to thank the organizers for the most hospitable lecture visit that I've had in years, being considerate of my own rest and peace of mind and giving me a chance to play some tennis and get my head together. And often there's just intense pressure and people sucking, draining the batteries down and making it hard to keep thinking at the higher levels of what we should be doing with our planet, especially right now. Right now, we're all aware that the world is in a process of dramatic change, historical change. The most important day, I think, in the history of the world happened last week. Actually, it happened over a period of about a week. This is my old boss, George Bush, announced unilaterally that the United States would pull back categories of weapons from Europe and from submarines and take the bombers off alert and take the ICBMs off alert. And Gorbachev responded with a similar announcement. And then a few days later, the NATO countries announced that they were going to cut 80% of the nuclear weapons. Now, there's still a lot of cynicism, and there's still 60,000 thermonuclear weapons in this world of ours. And there's confusion and chaos in Russia and people competing for those weapons and all of that. And we're all well aware of that. But you see, at least symbolically, more than symbolically, this represented the watershed, the turning point. Before that point, we had been heading on a collision course with Armageddon. We had been building redundancy of nuclear weapons and 15 countries getting them, and now 20 eventually are going to get them. But there was no end in the process while we were ranting and raving at each other between the superpowers. And the two leaders, now mind you, again, lots of cynicism behind it and all of that, but nevertheless announcing a decision that we are not going to head towards Armageddon. We're going to head towards tuning this thing down, a conscious decision by two of the most important leaders in the world to work in the opposite direction, a turning point in history. And we also watched just a few weeks ago the Soviet people blocking a very cynical coup attempt and effectively ousting or stopping or terminating a harsh, massive, brutal regime that had been in power for 70 years and had led to millions of people's deaths and suffering, and they did it peacefully. That's what's so exciting about this, and the dramatic change in Middle Europe that's happened in the past couple of years, again, peacefully. Gigantic revolutionary change done peacefully. I can think of nothing in history quite like it. I feel like we're standing in a period of sunshine historically. It's just a beautiful moment in history. It's an exciting moment in history, albeit with thunderclouds on the horizon in every direction. And we just came out from under the dark cloud of the arms race, the Cold War of Armageddon. And the question, of course, is, are we going to slide, under another dark cloud? And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. At the same time, the cynicism, of course. We haven't seen the end of cynicism by any manner of means. Our president down in the United States orchestrated and led the nation recently to the Persian Gulf War, and perhaps 300,000 Iraqis died in the process. He announced that there will be 20 nations by the turn of the century with nuclear weapons. That was the kind of thing I was bringing out in years past, and they were kind of downplaying and denying. It was in the paper the other day that the satellites are showing that between 50,000 and 80,000 fires burning in the Brazil, the Amazon basin, as they fell the rain trees annually and as they burn them to put the carbon up into the atmosphere. So like I say, it's not an end of cynicism or problems, it's just a moment of hope. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? Surely, right now at this watershed, at this most important day in the history of the planet, it's time for us to reassess what has happened, what is happening, and of course, simultaneously in all of this, we have the President of the United States bringing together what he calls the New World Order, promising a dramatic organizational change in the organization of the powers of the world. And so that too, what does that bring to us? Where are we going? Now is the time to reassess. That's what I propose to do tonight. I'm going to use, if you'll permit me, a vehicle of reviewing my own experience of the last 12 years since I've been speaking publicly and trying to figure this all out, but also the Reagan Revolution, which happened simultaneously in this period of time. They were concurrent. And as you'll see, I think they give us a pretty good indication of where we are now, how we got here, and where we're going. My own discovery program, coming out of the CIA, 3 secret wars, the last one on a subcommittee of the National Security Council as the chief of the CIA secret war in Angola, coming out, tiptoeing out, very much afraid, very much off balance, just knowing I'd been part of something that was wrong, determined to speak out about it, testifying to the committees, 60 minutes, facing the public, writing my first book. But I didn't know what we had been part of. There were lots of people better informed than I. I was a soldier, I was like a fullback. I knew what it felt like and smelled like and sounded like to duck your head and charge into the line, but I didn't know anything about coaches and salaries and athletic departments and pro football teams and the place of sports in society. And somewhat reluctantly, I had actually planned to write my book and disappear into a quiet life, but I let myself be dragged into an odyssey, a trip of reading, travel, meeting people who were thinkers and doers in this world, going to countries like Grenada, where I met Maurice Bishop and Bernard Cord and Phyllis Cord and the others, and hearing very intelligent, well-educated people involved in a Marxist revolution, hearing their rationales for what they were doing. Jamaica, where the CIA was running a destabilization in the election campaign, to Cuba, which had been the target of CIA operations, and we had fought Cuba and Angola in my war, to Nicaragua, as they launched the covert action there of the 80s. In the early days, in the first year, this thing was taken identically from the blueprint of my operation. So I could recognize fine details of what they were doing and even some of the people involved. And while I was there meeting a woman who had, mind you, you sit in Washington rationalizing these things in terms of national security, and you're 10,000 miles away from where people are suffering, and you don't write cables inside the building saying, like from Tegucigalpa or from Luanda up to Washington, saying, our forces raped 75 women today and killed 300 children. It's all in esoteric terms of accomplishing this and logistics and standing up to the evil, the rationales of the thing. But they introduced me to a woman who had been gang raped by men working for my former colleagues. And they showed me, and I held a child who had recently been maimed by CI pyrotechniques. And this was a deep psychic bruise to sit and hold a child involved in what I had spent, half of a career, half of an adult working time doing. And it also left me with a sense of rage to watch these things going on, knowing what we had learned from Angola and Vietnam and the other places. I also went back to Vietnam, the scene of that crime, where I'd served and come out in April of '75. And I set out in the process of this to read, just making it a habit to read a book a week. And you keep that up over, years going by, and you get into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books and the articles. And of course, meeting Helen Caldecott, meeting Carl Sagan, meeting the admirals at the Center for Defense Information, and many other people, and public debates and lectures and question and answer. And I think growing and figuring some things out and then going on to figure some other things out, the first thing I got into was reading about CI covert operations. There are hundreds of books about them, well documented now. Just briefly, and mind you, I'm obliged, I regret, to insult your intelligence by just skimming across the top of dramatic and profound events. I mean, the Vietnam War, people have gotten PhDs in one little tiny slice program of the U.S. involvement of what we call the Vietnam War. And we've got an hour, to go through and put it all together in a big picture. We will have a long question and answer to discuss, and more specifically as you choose. But what I found generally, the church committee reports. Just to summarize for you, the CI has done in its 45, 50-year history something in the neighborhood of 3,000 major covert operations and 10,000 minor operations. And Senator Church, investigating these things in 1975, defined a minor operation would include an attempt to kill a foreign chief of state. That would not be a major operation. And we had run 3,000 major operations. Some of these bloody and cynical beyond belief. The Indonesian operation of 1964, the CI set out to discredit the Communist Party, making it look like they would rise up, provoking a reaction from the army in which 800,000 people, according to the CIA's own estimates, were killed. And in the aftermath, the CIA wrote reports recommending that this be a model that be considered and copied elsewhere in the world, because it had not only eliminated one of the world's larger communist parties, it had eliminated the entire segment of the population, the Indonesian ethnic Chinese, that tended to support the communists. And that is nothing more or less than genocide and the advocacy of genocide. The Office of Public Safety for 26 years, until the international outcry forced the United States to stop, was training tens of thousands of military and police officers in the techniques of population control and repression and torture. CIA officers going down to work in liaison, as we called it, with the police in Latin and Central America and Asia and Africa, and literally give them equipment for torture and teach classes in the techniques of torture. Once again, we can go into that in greater detail if you like, but just to give you a sense of how depraved it got in fact and detail. One of the most famous advocates of this thing, 7 years in Brazil, 3 in Uruguay, Dan Mitrione, would pick up beggars, have them picked up to be used in his torture training classes, with the horror being that the beggars were known to be innocent of any wrongdoing, and they couldn't say, here are the names you want, stop hurting me. They could only lie there and scream, and when they would collapse, he would have doctors brought in to shoot them up with vitamins to rest them up for the next class. Now, this, reading into all of this, and again visiting the countries and realizing the full truth of it, gave me enormous pause, because 90% of the people in the CIA, the ones you meet and work with, if you're inside the building, inside the headquarters, inside the glamorous stations, inside of embassies, are very nice, decent people. I assure you this is true. If they were 9 feet tall with platinum teeth dripping blood, there would be no problem, because everyone would look and recoil and run away from them. They're hired and screened to be nice people. They live with their families. They believe in what they're doing, and they do not see the evil of what they're doing. Now, this is an important point for you to grasp. We human beings have an endless capacity to rationalize what we do to other people, especially people who are far away from us. In the case of Dan Mitrione, again, even though he crossed the line, he was not sitting in Washington rationalizing from afar national security policies. He was hands-on with people that he knew were innocent, that he was making to suffer. But he was nevertheless a devout Catholic, a devoted family man, father of 4, and a highly respected member of the embassy community of which he was part. And the others who live in Washington, who just spend their careers gathering intelligence, let me put it this way, quite sincerely. If you were living in an apartment building and had a CIA family down the hall, and you knew they were CIA, and then ordinary civilian, other people, otherwise up and down the hall, if you went on vacation, it's likely that the CIA people would be the ones you'd give your keys to feed your cats while you were gone. They're screened to be stable, to be bright. The mic, will the technician check the mic, please? I thought I could detect a lack of, are we on it? While he works on it, can you hear me in the back if I just project? I didn't do anything. I don't think.
There's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
No, okay, fine.
This is not a CIA plot. Can you hear me now? Yes. Yes, we all hear the resonance. The year I went into the CIA, there were 40,000 applicants. They hired 42 in our class, once again screening them carefully to screen out weirdos and maladaptive people to make sure that they were nice, decent, functional people. Once again, however, when Mitrione died, what he was doing, he had the support of the CIA directors, of the president, of the Congress, of the media. This was national security, and of the great majority of the people of the United States and Canada and around the world, that this was somehow important to our security to fight communism. And then they give you the rationale that, well, if you are out in a place like I was running wars, I never ran a torture program, but I sure ran some wars, that, well, it's a tough, dangerous world, and someone has to be tough enough to do these things. And then you get into, like, football players working up a hate against the team you're going to play, and you get into conscious demonization, as we all saw President Bush and his staff do against Saddam Hussein in preparation for the Persian Gulf War. And mind you, there are people out there in the world who are not hard to demonize. Without Mr. Bush's direction, I probably would not have seen Saddam Hussein as a nice person to begin with. But this instinct is so basically human that we see it in the peace movement. Now, this is tricky. As I'm trying so hard to figure out to work, I shut down my lectures this summer to rethink the world and also rethink my own anger and rage and how we're going to work together. And then I go on the speaking tour in the fall, and I get to San Francisco last week, and they had taken a 14-year-old photograph. I wish I still looked like that to begin with. And they had airbrushed a Saddam Hussein mustache on me and Omar Sharif eyebrows and put Stephen King eyes. And the photograph was taken before some bookcases, and they had airbrushed out the books so I wouldn't look intellectual to make me look like an enraged terrorist, like a killer. And then, the lines in the thing about, I'm going to stick it to the CIA and my lectures out here, i.e. demonizing me, if you will, whom they were bringing out to speak, to be their hero in a fight against, the forces of evil and all of that. I expressed my displeasure to them and pointed out, that I was on a different trip. But once again, getting back to the theme, reading about the domestic operations, the CIA operating on campuses, recruiting professors to build files on students, publishing books full of CIA propaganda and professors' names, drug experimentation programs in Canada and the United States on innocent victims, unwitting people, drug smuggling, every major area of operations of the CIA, like Southeast Asia, like Central America, like Afghanistan, has left behind a major drug cartel that has been built up with CIA aircraft. And once again, the CIA staff officers involved are relatively, they're surprisingly clean of the corruption of the drug smuggling itself. And they have elaborate rationales even for being involved in creating drug cartels. Once again, in the question and answer, we can get into that fine point in greater detail if you like. And then reading all of the books that I could find, all of the recent books on the JFK assassination, and finding that people relating to the CIA, there's massive evidence, of course, of a conspiracy, but massive evidence indicating that quite possibly CIA renegades, a lot of the names that appear in the trail, in the fog, in the mass of circumstantial evidence around the Kennedy killing are people that I knew or knew of or worked with someone who worked with one of these people. But getting back to the overall, the summary of the CIA operations, I came up eventually with the figure that 6 million people had died around the world as a result of CIA destabilizations that would not have died if we had not been spending our money organizing these wars. And then I began to read on, like, what kind of people? It's a tough world out there. I was a soldier. I knew, I had been taught it was a tough world out there. And I saw the common denominator early on and then read on, and it was never contradicted. We never ran the bloody, gory operations in the Soviet Union itself, the enemy in the Cold War, not since 1954, the first year that it actually developed a capability of dropping an atomic bomb on the United States. We didn't run the bloody, gory things in destabilizations in England, Canada, Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, etc. The 6 million people that were killed, and that's got to be a minimum figure in these things over 50 years, were people of the Mitumba Mountains of the Congo and the jungles of Southeast Asia and the hills of Nicaragua. They were people, interestingly enough, fascinating, who had no capability of doing physical hurt to the United States and didn't seem in any, or at least very few cases, to want to hurt the United States. Just to take one example, Nicaragua, which I visited a total of 10 times, the 50,000 casualties there, they were obviously not Russians, not Cold War enemies. They were not Cubans. They were not even percentage-wise mostly Sandinistas. They were mostly rag-poor peasants, including a high percentage of women and children. Communists? That doesn't work. They were almost altogether Roman Catholics. Enemies of the United States? That doesn't work either, because we had thousands of witnesses from the US and Canada and Europe and Australia go down to live in the villages with the Nicaraguan people, and they invariably came back and reported that the Nicaraguans were the friendliest people on the face of the earth, perhaps, and they loved people from the United States, and they couldn't understand why we would want, our leaders would want to organize a force that would go into their villages and haul them out and rape and mutilate and castrate them while their children were forced to watch, and sometimes reverse the process and kill and mutilate their children while they were forced to watch. And I wound up, of course, screaming in anguish, why? Why would my country want to do these things, to organize these things that would kill and make so many people so miserable, people who couldn't hurt us if they wanted to? And so I read on. I found the most important book of all the books that I've read to understanding. This is Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. How many people have read this book? A People's History of the United States. Write it down. Tomorrow, don't go to work, cut your classes, stay home and read this book. There is nothing that could possibly be more important, more educational, that you could do in the next day or few days than to read this book. Howard Zinn is saying, you've read a lot of books about U.S. history and the history of this hemisphere and the history of the world, about the governments and the interests of big business. I'm going to write you a book about the history of the people, their interest, who fought in the wars, who profited from the wars, who died in the wars. And what I found was that, contrary to what I'd been taught, the U.S. is very much a warring, war-loving nation. Now, we carefully teach ourselves that we're a peace-loving nation. And of course, the opposite is true. You skim through this book and think a little bit, and you see that the United States, in its brief history of a couple of hundred years, has in fact fought as many wars as anyone. 15 or so major wars, 50 years we've spent at war, 200 more actions in which we put our forces into other countries to force them to our will about once a year. We maintain 375 bases around the world to maintain our military presence around the world, to protect violently, if necessary, our interests. And then you read down a little bit and you realize that every one of those wars has been orchestrated by the leaders of that time. There were debates in Congress, there were advocates of the war. They didn't happen by accident. They didn't happen by someone invading the U.S. and us desperately responding against them. There was cynicism, there was profiteering, there were leaders, presidents sometimes, Congress people who were saying we need to do this war. For example, on page 290 of Howard Zinn's book, Teddy Roosevelt is quoted a letter he wrote, quote, "In strict confidence I should welcome almost any war, for I think the country needs one." This was the Spanish-Cuban-American War that he eventually helped to orchestrate us into and fight in himself with great glory. And at that same time, labor leaders representing the workers of the United States were saying the same thing: the country needs a war. So for pragmatic interest, they wanted that war to happen. Each war, after the orchestration of public opinion to support it and the demonizing of the enemy, has a trigger. Mysteriously or coincidentally, but often quite contrived, in which, for example, in the Spanish-Cuban-American War, the battleship Maine blew up a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor. The Lusitanian World War I, and remember, again, the Howard Zinn type quote on every page. Kate Richards O'Hare, 1915, said, "The women of the United States are nothing but brood sows producing sons to be put in the army to be turned into fertilizer," and she was sentenced to 5 years in jail for anti-war talk, which was illegal. Pearl Harbor, we now have well-documented Our leaders knew the Japanese fleet was sailing to Pearl Harbor to attack it. They did not warn our admirals so they could get the fleet safely out to sea. They let our fleet be sunk and 2,300 sailors and soldiers be killed to trigger the United States into the war as they wanted. The good war, as Studs Terkel calls it in his book of the same title. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to justify the Vietnam War turned out to be an exaggeration, a distortion, and a fraud. The Mexican War, for example, in 1846, the Congress first approved, they offered $2 a head for everybody who would enlist to go and fight. They didn't get enough takers. They offered 100 acres of land to everyone, every veteran who came back. They did not get enough takers, so they sent Zachary Taylor down to parade up and down the disputed border until he clashed with the Mexicans. Then the headlines read, "Mexicans killing our boys in Texas." And the nation rose up and we went down and fought and took away from Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, part of Colorado, and the state of California. I submit to you that in this war-loving country, the United States, that the conditioning to war begins at the age of 2, when we put our kids in front of the one-eyed babysitter and turn it on. Now, children, I don't know how many of you have raised children recently, but they don't take to television automatically. You have to teach them. You sit them down and to salve your conscience, you turn on one of the intellectual kids shows, and then you go to wash dishes or to do some work, and they come trotting after you because they want human contact. And so you take them back and, say, look at the show, and then they learn how to click the knob and start finding the gory ones, and they wind up watching 10 to 20 shows a day. All of them with the same plot. I call it the American syndrome. Every one of them has nice, sweet, attractive, normally light-colored people, or creatures, She-Man, the Thundercats, that are put upon by ugly, evil, usually dark forces like Skeletor, and they always say, "Please be nice, we don't want trouble." And the evil forces always insist on attacking. And then you have He-Man with his great phallic sword, "I have the power," and they rise up at the last minute and they beat down evil, but never defeat it totally. They beat it down and Skeletor flashes and disappears into the universe because cut, commercial, you begin the same story again with different characters, again 15 to 20 times a day, until it's estimated, and this is not an exaggeration, that kids by the time they graduate from high school have spent more hours watching violence on television than they have in the classrooms themselves. Now the latest shocking study that we got the other day that we're digesting is that the cartoons of today have no female hero figures, none, only male, only boys. And I was out in LA with some writers. I'm working on some screenplays now, and there was a woman writer for cartoon shows there, and I asked her about this study, and she said it's quite true. It's fatal. If a show is pulled to be popular with 9-year-old girls, they cut it. If it's pulled to be popular with 9-year-old boys in the violence, they run it. And then there's the Nintendo, of course, where they sit there for hours and hours playing kill, 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 and it's electronic, and so it's okay. It's not a human. There's no responsibility for what they're doing. And football, very much a military training game where you have the platoon and the platoon leader, the lieutenant, the quarterback, and the general on the sideline, and the players are taught on the field to sacrifice their bodies and to hate the other side and try to destroy them. Then you have the movies that we watched during the 1980s, a particular period of military buildup I'll get to in just a minute. The Rambo, Commando, Red Dawn, the Rocky series, Under Siege, Delta Force, America, Missing in Action, Top Gun, Heartbreak Ridge, Death Before Dishonor, Hamburger Hill, Tour of Duty, China Beach, the list goes on and on. And I want to take, and for some of you this is a review if you've heard me before, but I want to go through this again because we are reassessing. And for others, I think it'll just help you forever to understand how these things work. How many people saw the movie Red Dawn? Now, this is a good movie. It was a gripping movie. It was also, the producers went on television shows saying their purpose was to make a movie that would make people warm up to the idea of war, to see war positively. It was intended to be a war propaganda film. And so it's fair for us to analyze it as such. And in doing so, you look at it, the first thing you notice that it's a science fiction film. It's not a true scenario. There's a force of Russians, Cubans, and Nicaraguans in the United States. Blow off our 30,000 thermonuclear weapons and our army and all of that. It's just the force is there, that's the given, and the movie begins. And so you say, well, for propaganda purposes, why did they pick Russia, Cuba, and Nicaragua? I mean, it would be a better war movie if they had picked Russia, Canada, and Mexico. And you can see the Russians coming over, and Canada and all across the border plunging, you know, down into the U.S. and pinning us up against Mexico, you know, and kind of get your head into that. And the answer, of course, is that, one, Cuba is a traditional designated enemy, and when they brought this film out in the early 1980s, it was, they were planning to invade Nicaragua in a war. And so they were beginning to orchestrate or condition people to see Nicaragua as an enemy that would like to invade us. So you go on in the analysis, you watch the film, the Soviet forces, the enemy forces get all the way to the Rocky Mountains, where they're eventually stopped by the high school football team and the cheerleaders. And so you ask yourself immediately, you know, why? I mean, this is the 1980s. This was the decade of the middle-aged women. You had Dallas and Dynasty and Murder, She Wrote and Golden Girls and middle-aged women working out with Nautilus and jogging, and Joan Collins, a sex symbol, and she's older than I am, and that's good. And so for a modern war film, you should have had the enemy force being stopped by school teachers. So why did they pick the high school football team and the cheerleader drinking deer's blood in the mountains and all of that? Well, the answer is very simple. They will never be able to get us 50-year-olds to fight their wars for them. A few crazy heads, but not a percentage, because we've seen the cynicism, we've seen previous wars, we just simply wouldn't buy it. Every society since the beginning of war, the beginning of organized societies, has called upon the teenagers whose minds are essentially empty of experience, of knowledge, except what they've been carefully taught in school, whose bodies are pumping with adrenaline and testosterone and romance and ambition, and they grab them and say, you know, go and fight, and they send them off to fight. And this film was showed to every National Guard unit that went down to Honduras to train and rehearse in preparation for the invasion, eventually, of Nicaragua. And then you get to the TV ads that run constantly down in the U.S. I hope you don't get them up here. But, you know, join the Army, be all that you can be. And they're good ads. They have the tanks jumping ditches at 60 miles an hour and the helicopters going 200 miles an hour with laser night vision and all of that. And this is very, very exciting. It's good gripping stuff like the Nintendo games. I watch it and come up on the edge of my chair thinking, boy, that would be fun. You know, you could, because when I was in the Marine Corps, we had, you know, tanks that would jump a very small ditch and break down, and there were no computers. And then, since I've been in 3 wars, I ask myself, wait a minute, what's missing here? Something's missing. Like, where are the kids with their intestines wrapped around their necks, with their legs blown off at the knees? The little girls running down the road burning with napalm. And the answer, of course, is that they're not trying to teach people about war and these things. They're trying to motivate them to join the Army and be all that they can be and be available to go down and fight the wars for the society and be killed and to kill people for them. Then you get into the most insidious thing I've ever seen, I think, on television. This is a young soldier who's coming home in uniform and by train. We don't travel by trains anymore, but it's a good, you know, imagery of war. And he's met by his younger brother, and he says, you know, Dad never did know why I had to join the Army. And then they're driving in the car. Did anyone see this up here? Have you seen this? And then they're driving in the car, and he says, do you think he'll ever forgive me? And then they walk into the home, and Dad turns and sees his handsome son in uniform and hugs him, and it's okay. Now, they played this thing constantly, endlessly. Super Bowl time, prime sports time for 10 straight years, spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on it. So why that much money on this particular message? What is the message? See, there were too many dads who were telling their sons, who had seen Korea and Vietnam, who were telling their sons, do not join the army. And they had to float the message out to the society that in American society, it's okay to defy your father's wisdom and join the army, and when you do, he will forgive you and everything will be okay in the end. And then there's the great peace commercial that they played every 30 minutes throughout the 1980s that said, do not join the army, do not go to war, it's not necessary, it shouldn't be, how many people saw this one? Anyone? Ever? Never in the course of history have they ever made a commercial with our tax dollars saying, do not join the army, that war is bad. They have only made war commercials endlessly, and I think until we, affect a different think down there, they never will, as they very well could spend our tax dollars to say there are reasonable and better ways to solve the world's problems. So once again, reading Howard Zinn and traveling and riding bicycles and protesting, but asking why. Why would we want to fight wars continuously, often against countries that could never hurt us? The suffering, of course, beyond measure. And the answer, of course, comes out quite clear. And I read lots of books about it and talked to the people. It's politics and profits. Properly done, war is great politics, and they make a lot of money at it. It's that simple. Follow the money. The United States has been, a giant military machine. As Seymour Melman called it in his book, a permanent war complex. The military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it, and warned us against it. We call it, to make it more palatable, a defense, the defense complex, the defense industry, to the anti-war movement in the United States. And he brought us what he called the Reagan Revolution. And everybody thought that was just a cute buzzword. They didn't realize that he and his backers were absolutely serious in their determination to effect a permanent revolutionary change in the United States, to take the pendulum and swing it to the right and weld it shut. They set out to rehabilitate the concept of war. Reagan gave hundreds of speeches to that effect. They set out to break the American people free from guilt and social responsibility. They joked about people on welfare. They seriously proposed that vegetables in the kids' school lunches could be pickle relish and ketchup. They appointed Ann Burford to head the Environmental Protection Agency, and she determinedly defended the offending corporations that were destroying the environment. They appointed Elliott Abrams to the Human Rights Division of the State Department with the mission of dismantling it. This was the division that had been created by Pat Darien under Jimmy Carter, taking testimony from refugees from the bad countries in the world. The confidential testimony, I escaped, my family is still there, they killed my father and my brothers, my mother and my sisters are still there, that kind of testimony. And Elliott Abrams, as he closed the unit down, sent the files back to the countries, the police in the countries in question. And then the INS began to send the refugees back to the countries in question. The appointment, Reagan's appointment to the Juvenile Division of the Justice Department, had a bumper sticker that said, "Have you slugged your kid today?" And his family pediatrician of his children went to Congress to testify and said, "You cannot put this man in a job where he has anything to do with children." James Watt, the Secretary of Interior, who taught with great zeal and passion that God has put these resources on earth and we are going to be faced with Armageddon, and so it's our divine mission to chop the trees and spend the resources and do what we want to do to the environment, because we're all going to be vaporized eventually anyway. And Jerry Falwell had dinner regularly, once a month in the White House in the first years, and he preaches that we should get on our knees and beg God to send down hell's fires on earth so the chosen can be called up, you know, the million or so that agree with him, and the other 5 billion can burn in hell's fires on earth. And he's having dinner in the White House with the man who's sitting there playing with the button, you know, the control of the nuclear weapons, who is joking about demonstration bombs in Europe, who accidentally goes on live radio saying he's already sent our missiles against the Soviet Union. And they're arguing vigorously in formal speeches that the Constitution is only a piece of paper written by men before, that we can tear it up and disregard it and do what we think is right today in today's world. They invaded Grenada. And then Reagan had from that his campaign slogan for the 1984 presidential campaign, America Feeling Great Again. And then they bombed Libya and killed Gaddafi's daughter. Now we know from the conservative columnists Evans and Novak, who published an op-ed, that the White House had been polling public opinion regularly as they orchestrated public opinion against Gaddafi, claiming he was a terrorist, to catch the opinion at a point where a bombing would be received favorably instead of rejected. And then you say, well, why? Why go to the trouble of orchestrating Gaddafi and bombing Libya? Well, the coincidence is that the bombing was done, I believe it was on April 12 of 1986, a week before Reagan went to Tokyo for the economic summit, in which it was announced that for the first time in 70 years, the United States had become a debtor nation. Now, they had to distract us from, you know, that sad news. And so everyone, all the journalists went to Japan talking about terrorism instead of talking about the United States' economic decline. Then after Grenada, the bumper stickers said Nicaragua next. And the speakers around President Reagan were saying that eventually we would have to do the Sandinistas. And he said emphatically, he said, the Sandinistas will not be in office when I leave office. They were planning war against Nicaragua. He also spoke constantly about his Contra program in Nicaragua and warned us about the grave danger from Nicaragua. Now, mind you, Nicaragua had no capability of doing physical hurt to the United States, and they never committed one act of war against the United States, and yet we spend $1 billion to destabilize Nicaragua. President Reagan, meanwhile, was saying that it was a Russian base in our own backyard. He was saying Soviets are flying airplanes in this hemisphere for the first time in all of history. Now, you don't have to be much of a historian. You just think a minute and you can see that that is not true, that he was not a very good historian himself. Aeroflot has been flying into this hemisphere since World War II, landing in Canada, New York, Mexico, not to mention in Cuba, and I presume those planes are not flown by people from Texas. But he went on. It's a 2-day drive, he said, from Harlingen, Texas to Managua. It takes Texans 4 or 5 days. But once again, a 2-hour flight by jet from Managua to San Diego. You can see the bombers sizzling up there to bomb Southern California. He said if we don't draw the line in Nicaragua, there'll be 1 million communists coming up across our borders from the south. And I went down to Nicaragua and looked around. There is no market there for U.S. goods. And they produce coffee and cotton, which is overproduced in the world, so that we have to have quotas. There's nothing that we depend on from Nicaragua. And suddenly it was crystal clear why the CIA has run its 13,000 covert operations destabilizing the world. The 6 million victims, dead people, were never enemies or a danger to the United States, but each one left behind a family that has now been traumatically conditioned to violence. Guarantee that we'll have an unstable world, guaranteeing that there will be continued wars. Nicaragua was a designated enemy. President Reagan played on it to create the feelings of paranoia and macho, because he was in the process of justifying the expenditure of $2.5 trillion on arms, on the largest military buildup in peacetime in the history of the world, one of the largest military buildups ever. Now, a moment of hope, a moment of gratification, is that the people of the United States, supported by people from Canada and elsewhere, stopped the invasion of Nicaragua. This is not a guesstimation or an assessment on my part. The Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, had a public debate with the Secretary of State, George Shultz, in which Weinberger was saying, "Not with my Defense Department, you don't. Not until you can sell it to the American people." And the polls showed that the American people were 67% against the invasion of Nicaragua. And Reagan was planning to try to cram it down the Joint Chiefs. The Pentagon was against this war. We're vetoing it. He was going to try to cram it down their throats against the will of the people in the Pentagon. And then the Iran-Contra scandal was broken over his head to stop him, and did stop him. And his presidency was emasculated, so he simply didn't have the presidential energy to do the invasion of Nicaragua. We stopped the invasion of Nicaragua. Perhaps 40,000 to 400,000 Nicaraguans are alive today who would otherwise have been killed if we hadn't done our work. Now, the conservatives argue that this stuff is tough. Now, mind you, these are intelligent, sincere people. They believe and they teach us. They're leaders like William Buckley and Tom Selleck, the movie star. They say, yes, it's tough. I'm sorry. People have to die in a tough world for us to be safe and secure. And so you think about it. Is this true? And by their own analysis, I come back with the conclusion that it's a tragic mistake, even if you have no morality or sympathy or empathy for the dead people and the suffering and the traumatic survivors, because of the problems that are created and the price and the cost. The arms race produced 60,000 thermonuclear weapons that still, despite the hope, that still are there, that still could destroy this planet effectively forever for warm-blooded life. And these things malfunction constantly. In the mid-'80s, I was reading about this and meeting Helen Caldecott and the admirals and Carl Sagan and Paul Newman. And Caldecott was teaching us that the world was terminally ill. And I was very pessimistic. It seemed like we were absolutely on a collision course with Armageddon. I remember meeting Carl Sagan, and I'd been saying, we will destroy this planet. It's inevitable unless we can find some. And he said, John, he said, it's grim, but it's not that bad. He said, this is like about 4 years ago. He said, we can talk to the Russians. We could work out this Cold War thing. And I could not believe him. I just couldn't see it. But of course, he was right. I wrote in 1983 a book, Red Sunset, in which I previewed Glasnost, 5 years before Gorbachev had appeared on the scene. I wrote it in 81 and 82. I had to use the metaphor of fiction because you simply couldn't, at the height of Reagan's madness, write a nonfiction book and sell it and publish it saying that the superpowers could communicate and could get together. So I did it through fiction. I also, in the mid-'80s, wrote the book Racing On about the arms race, trying to make it simple with illustrations so we could see and educate people to the horror of what was happening. We also have the social price of these activities, of the Reagan Revolution, of the buildup. There's been a whole matrix of what they call national security laws passed, every one of them curtailing individual freedoms and civil rights to the benefit of the national security complex and secrecy to protect people who murder, who kill, who organize wars, who lie, who betray the security interests of the United States itself. And President Reagan and President Bush have appointed 70% of the judges of conservative ilk to enforce those laws. They created FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that has on the books the provision for suspending the Constitution and declaring martial law, a military takeover. And these plans are secret. Even though they've been leaked out, people have come out and told us about these plans. When we ask about it, they say that's secret. Now, the implication of secret plans to suspend our Constitution by people who are saying it's only a piece of paper anyway and effect a military takeover, of course, has to be ominous and scary. The crime bill has provisions for them to list people who would be terrorists or terrorist sympathizers so that they can go into the homes of such designated people and kill them with impunity without any due process of the law. And the drug bill, which is based on false premises, greatly exaggerated threats, we'll talk about it in the Q&A if you like, obtained the drug law, which effectively abolishes the Bill of Rights. Now, under the drug war in the United States, on the basis of the signature of a DEA officer stamped by a sympathetic judge, they can arrest anyone they like and haul them away and take away their house, their car, their savings, the money with which they would hire attorneys to defend themselves without indicting them, much less convicting them, blow off all of the protections, blow off the innocent until proven guilty. And these changes are on the books once again. They have not been using them promiscuously, but they are on the books with the judges in place to enforce them if they ever should decide to. The environment, of course, you're well aware of the rapid pace at which we've been destroying the environment in this period of time as well as before. President Reagan leading the way with his famous statement, "If you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all." And again, James Watt with his cynicism towards the environment. 50 years of nuclear pollution in Pantex near Amarillo, Texas, where we were going up to protest each year. They would take to get rid of the liquid wastes. They didn't want to go to Congress and say we need $10 billion because that would be a political controversy. They took Caterpillar tractors and scooped tanks in the ground and didn't even line them and poured the toxic material in there where it could blow into surrounding fields, evaporate up into the sky, and trickle down into the Oglala aquifer. The proliferation of automobiles, the gluttony of consumption that we're all guilty of. The felling of the rainforests, again, the 50,000 fires that are going on today. 6 submarines sunk into the ocean with nuclear devices on board. 52 parts of nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors now littering the bottom of the ocean that will still be toxic 50,000 years from now. The Chernobyl plants all around the world. The Soviets selling the engineers who built the Chernobyl plants selling internationally reactors to be used in space. And then you get into the cost of what happened in the 1980s under the Reagan Revolution. And before that, the presidents before him, including Jimmy Carter, who actually launched the arms buildup that Reagan and now Bush have pushed ahead with. The United States was the undisputed economic superpower at the end of World War II, and the leaders have utterly squandered that advantage, so that now the United States is a debtor nation with the largest debt in the history of the world. In the late 70s, it was a creditor nation. When Reagan came into office, the U.S. debt was $905 billion. Reagan spent $2.5 trillion on arms. That's their published figure. They often, publish lower figures. We came out of that era with a $3 trillion debt. The U.S. debt now is passing $4 trillion. And in effect, not literally, but in effect, it's double compounding. The deficit runs out of control, over $300 billion. And the trade deficits. We can't keep up with the countries overseas, so there's the effect of double compounding the debt. The highest line item, the biggest chunk of our tax dollars goes to pay the bankers interest and service on the loan. And of course, that is the reason why this debt is not threatening to our leaders, because they respond to the financial leaders, the international bankers, who hold the paper. And to them, this is a wonderful debt because it's guaranteed by the American people and the U.S. government. Ronald Reagan, selling the country on MX missiles and on SDI, he spent more media time, we've counted the hours, on his Contra program in Nicaragua, a country with 2 elevators, While our allies were building Sonys and Toyotas, and Japan managed to capture 30% of the overseas international exchange, and today the United States is no longer in control of its economic destiny. This has been called by Time magazine, by the conservative organs down in the United States, as the decade of greed and corruption. Hundreds of billions of dollars spent on arms, but the key to understanding this, now get this if nothing else from this lecture, is the defense corporations make 20 to 25% profit, while the norm for other industries in the society is about 10%. But the key, and this is the punchline, is the defense corporations, as we call them, are not U.S. companies. These are international, multinational corporations. They are sucking out of the United States and its allies that cooperate with it in the arms race these enormous profits and investing the money overseas in other countries that are building trade goods, so they're bleeding us laterally through the trade deficits at the same time. During this period of time, there was a massive transfer of wealth from the middle and poor classes to the ultra-rich. The taxes for the ultra-rich were cut from 70% to 32%, and they were raised for the poor. The SNL ripoff. This was a double ripoff. First, the bankers squandered and stole our savings, and then now the government is telling us that we have to pay $1 trillion to restore the banking industry, to restore our confidence in the banking industry of thieves that stole our money to begin with. If you can follow the logic in that one, I can't. The median salary in the United States is lower today than it was in Eisenhower's day. President Reagan left office boasting that he had cut 1,000 social services, and George Bush's first proclamation when he became president is that he would cut another 1,000 social services. Not surprisingly, the United States has dropped to 10th and 20th in the world in health, education, housing, longevity, infant mortality. They're gutting Social Security to cover the deficit. It's calculated that the baby boomers, the people 45 and under who are definitely paying the FICA, the Social Security withholdings in their taxes each year, will never collect any Social Security when they cross the age of 65. I submit that the people in the United States only seem rich because we compare ourselves with refugees from Central America. In the 1980s, I told people to go to Nicaragua and see for yourselves. Now I've been telling people to go to the civilized countries of the world. Go to Europe. They have sick leave, maternity leave, 1 month's vacation, general medical care, higher salaries, and the social infrastructure is built up like modern countries would be expected to be. It's utterly fascinating to watch the American people cheer while this process is taking place. Take me, I'm yours. Steal everything I've got, drive us down, make of the United States a third world country, and a bad third world country at that, and just give us a war or two and talk to us nicely, and we'll feel great again. George Bush, my old boss, vice president under Ronald Reagan, became president, of course, in 1989. Now, this is a genuinely nice man and a very intelligent man and a very sincere man. Working with him is a pleasure. He drives hard. You have to have tremendous energy. I was not on his staff. I was running the Angola operation. He became CIA director. He remembers people's names. He relates to people. He shakes your hand like he means it. And you're thinking, will he remember my name next time? And you get a card in the mail saying, sorry, your kid, Johnny is sick. Let us know if there's anything Barbara and I can do to help. Now, he's the best qualified president probably in the history of the United States, quite possibly one of the most intelligent. Certainly, I would say the best politician perhaps in the history of the United States. Quite aware of his elitist background, of his British nobility heritage, ambassador to China, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA, international oil man, remembering names on a first-name basis with most of the leaders of the world, it seems. Very conscious of his East Coast elitist background of Yale, of Skull and Bones, belonging to the all of the elite inner conservative male groups, relating to the interests of the ultra-rich. Now, mind you, this is where we get into a point I'll make later on. He is a sincere man. He sincerely believes that the world will be a better place if the interests of the rich are taken care of. He does not relate to the problems of the people. If you look at his record in office, he has vetoed every bill that was submitted. With a hostile Congress, a Democratic Congress, he's vetoed more bills, I read, than any other president. Every bill that has been designed in any way to grant a reprieve to the people of the United States, he has vetoed. And every bill that would in any way curtail the greed and corruption of the rich, he has vetoed. His position on Clarence Thomas was no surprise when Anita Hill made her charges against Clarence Thomas. Before she made her charges, before George Bush had a chance to hear them and judge them, he said this was a cheap smear against a fine man, prejudging it. His use of Clarence Thomas, being a conservative black man, for political purpose was not surprising because we saw the utter cynicism of what he did politically with Willie Horton in the 1988 presidential campaign, using a big, ugly, bearded black man who had raped a white woman and putting the woman on national television constantly and blaming it unfairly on Michael Dukakis, using the race issue. Bush has been haunted throughout his political career by what the press calls the wimp factor, the wimp image that he had. I always said this was a bum rap. There's nothing weak about this man. He has known for years what he wanted. He has worked for years on his ambitions and to represent his interests. And then I watched him come into office, and I watched his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, mind you, the conservative columnists in the winter of 1987 were writing that his political career was over because of his involvement in Iran-Contra. And then he survived somehow, and then people were writing that if he did not become president, he might face some kind of investigation or indictment if he didn't get into power itself. And then in 1988, we saw Noriega boasting, foolish man, that he had blackmail control over George Bush. Newsweek quoted him as saying, quotation marks, "I have George Bush by the balls," referring to the fact that they had worked together when Bush was the CIA director and then again when Bush was vice president. And Noriega, with his drug smuggling, with his vulnerability, disagreeing or breaking with the Reagan Contra program, the Reagan-Bush Contra program, this was a very foolish position for him to take. I predicted 9 months before it happened that the United States would invade Panama. I predicted this on national television and in the House of Commons in London. And it was not, to me, it seemed very clear. I had also predicted the invasion of Grenada 9 months before it happened, simply on the basis of when a U.S. president, as Reagan did in March of '83, he said Grenada was a threat to U.S. national security interests. Of all the things he could talk about, of all the countries in the world, this little island 16 miles long with 80,000 people on it, he's calling it a threat to our national security. I said he's got plans for Grenada. And then you looked and found the Marine Corps was rehearsing the Amberine Islands, as in Grenadine Islands, invasion, and I said they're going to hit Grenada, and they did. Again, predicting the invasion of Panama, which happened in December of 1989, showing Bush, was not a wimp. He was down on a ranch in South Texas shooting doves while we were bombing and killing 2,000 people in Panama and doing $2 billion worth of damage to that country. No wimp, Mr. Bush. But the Panama invasion was over quickly, and it solved nothing of the problems that were facing the United States. By the spring of 1990, The country was stirring. We're in a definite recession. People waking up to how our pockets have been cut. The president's son involved in the SNL scandal. The Cold War had broken. The Berlin Wall down. The military facing sharp cuts in the budget. And President Bush had no solutions for the domestic problems and the budget problems and the deficit problems. And the conservative columnists, not to mention the liberals, were beginning to write that this man was a one-term president like Jimmy Carter. And it didn't take much smarts, I felt, to say that formula leads to war. This is, if you've read Howard Zinn, the pattern in which the formula the United States has to have, our leaders have to have a distraction to take the people's minds off the domestic problems. I said, we'll go to war. And then they began orchestrating Cuba, saying Fidel, Cuba was the last bastion of communism in the world. And so I said, and others picked up on the line, the United States was going to make a war against Cuba in the '92 elections, but meanwhile Saddam Hussein came along and gave George Bush the fabulous present of invading Kuwait, which is run by oil billionaires, and threatening Saudi Arabia, which is run by oil billionaires, and George Bush is an international oil man. Now we can get into the provocation and circumstances of Saddam Hussein's invasion, but for right now, to move on quickly, you all know what happened. George Bush responded instantly. He decided immediately that the war would be fought against Iraq. He orchestrated it carefully, brilliantly. He got 28 nations to back it up. He coined the phrase, the New World Order. They fought it carefully, brilliantly with modern technology. They won decisively. They fed the people carefully tailored news that made it look like a Nintendo game where our missiles and bombs never missed. And now George Bush is seen to be unbeatable in the '92 elections. He boasted that they had erased the stigma of the Vietnam War. They had taught the nation once again that war was good, that it was winnable, that it was a proper thing for American people to do. At the request of the Saudi leaders and the Kuwaiti leaders, he let Saddam Hussein's forces escape with their army intact, and then let them use their attack helicopters in violation of the ceasefire agreement to suppress the rebellion, the uprising of the Kurds, of the Iraqi people that he, George Bush, had called for. And as you know, Harvard, they're estimating 300,000 Iraqis dead and dying, miserable deaths today, the country's infrastructure bombed back to the Stone Ages, the suffering beyond belief. And so I ask people, does that make George Bush some kind of a monster? And the answer, simply put, is no. It makes him a typical U.S. president doing what the society, morality is defined by a given society, and the American society, the American moralists, the American churches, the people rose up and cheered loudly and supported the troops coming back, and his popularity soared. Every other president has done that in one form or the other. That is the American way in the harsh world in which we live, unless or until we change our perception of proper conduct for our leaders. Now, I repeat, the U.S. is no longer in control of its economic destiny. The United States is now the Praetorian Guard of the New World Order. That's the title of my latest book, brought out this year. We have copies again for sale in the back there. The U.S. as the cops of the New World Order. George Kennan wrote in 1945 that eventually the world conflict would devolve into a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And that's where we are today. The Soviet Union has effectively disintegrated, asking us for help, cooperating with us in so many different ways. They're casting about for new enemies, for new rationales. They've got problems finding them in present world because there is one superpower today, and that's the United States. So they're proposing, despite the U.S. economic problems, to spend $1.5 trillion to retool the military as cops to fight the wars of the future, which they say will be in the third world like the Persian Gulf War was. And like cops, the people of the United States are expected to live on the crumbs, to accept modest salaries while they defend the world, the New World Order, for the World Financial Order, for the interests of the world bankers. In closing, I would summarize and note that the New World Order, George Bush, he had very much a leadership part in presiding over the end of the Cold War, and that's good. He recently announced pulling us back from the brink of Armageddon, the unilateral withdrawal of nuclear forces. And that's good, and the USSR reciprocated, and the NATO countries have responded, and that's all good. We're pulling nuclear weapons out of Korea, and that's good, so we can go in and inspect the North Korean nuclear facilities, and that's good. He's announced that the military will launch a massive cleanup of U.S. military toxic pollution from the past 4 and 5 decades. A big program, spending billions of dollars to seriously attack this pollution, and that's good. The EPA that used to run interference for the corporations now came out with a study just a couple of weeks ago in which they said the ozone problem is worse than the environmentalists claimed. It is a crisis. We have to attack it urgently. And that's good because it is a crisis. There's serious discussion about serious cutbacks in the military. They're proposing, of course, to cut it from $300 billion to $290 billion, which is not massive cuts. They call it massive cuts, but I'm sorry, it's not enough to reduce the deficit to stop this hemorrhaging of the U.S. economy. So there's serious discussion of massive cuts that we can jump upon today and effect these cuts if we will. And Time magazine and Parade magazine have run cover articles, feature articles, raising the question, do we still need a CIA? Is it time to close the CIA? And Senator Patrick Moynihan has a bill before the Congress saying the CIA was a Cold War organ. The Cold War is over. It should not run covert actions. Its intelligence function should be put in the State Department, and the military should defend our country if it's ever attacked. And that's good. However, at the same time, our country is still planning, as I said, to spend another $1.5 trillion to restructure the military, and that's bad. We have other needs for our money as the economy is collapsing. The New World Order will not bring greater equity, clearly, in money, in wealth, and resources in the world or in the United States itself. It will certainly not, because of the national security laws and FEMA, it does not promise to bring greater freedom or civil liberties or human rights. It will not bring greater or better social services, schools and hospitals and whatnot for the United States and related countries. We have, nevertheless, this moment of sunshine at the end of the Cold War, when there are open discussions of reversing the whole process. We can get upon this and turn it into a momentum to reverse the policies of the Cold War. You can feel the energy if we just will. If we fail to act, we have economic problems and a military cutback and the election of '92 coming up next year, and people have already forgotten the Persian Gulf War, and they are now orchestrating Cuba again. They will do Fidel's Cuba in the next 6 to 9 months before the '92 elections. They will either do it with a destabilization and a takeover, but one in which the exiles who were part of Bautista's society will go back, and they will take with them the instant death squads. They will purge the society, they will track down people, they will haul people away to clean out Fidel's cadres, and we will watch thousands and thousands of Cubans die in that process if George Bush and the people around him do not find it necessary or do not succeed in orchestrating the country, public opinion, other countries to support while he bombs Cuba back to the Stone Ages as he did Iraq. What I'm saying is that the people of Cuba are now caught between George Bush's and Fidel Castro's egos and political imperatives, and if we don't really get on that, we the people of the world, and make some noise about it and put pressure on them, a lot of Cubans are going to suffer and die. We're going to watch the continued bleeding of the U.S. by the multinational industrial complex, military-industrial complex, and the repercussions of that are going to be for the U.S. economy and related countries hyperinflation. Like you've got $1,000 today, like in Brazil, tomorrow it's worth $10. We're going to see the continued drop in the standard and quality of living in the United States. The sacred freedoms that the United States has boasted about for 200 years will be permanently relegated to history. We'll see the continued desperate deterioration of our environment. And these things are all scary and they're depressing. Last spring, however, driving in a car with my wife and our small son, a 12-year-old who's been with us to Grenada and Nicaragua and to Vietnam and has heard my lectures, and we were fulminating, and he rose up in protest and he said, look, I want to live, I want to go to school, I want to be happy, I want to play, will you give me a break? I want to play football and not feel like it's some kind of a negative political statement. And he busted our chops, and it led me to think a lot because I was, in fact, functioning in a cesspool of negative energy. And I shut down my lectures for the summer to think this stuff out, and I made some decisions. I recognized the fact that I want to live in this country. In the early 80s, I thought I did this country, meaning the United States, my country. I've thought about living in Canada, by the way. I went to Cuba to look in the early 80s, thinking, well, maybe they represent some higher ideal. And I went back to my wife's country, to Vietnam, and took a look. And I've lived overseas 17 years, so it was not, a naive look. I went to look in Grenada to see if I wanted to live there. I don't. I want to live in the United States. There are nicer places, there are places with higher standards of living, but I got family there and I'm used to its ways. This means I have to respect the laws and the system and work properly to change it. People often ask, how come I'm still alive, standing up as I have to the cynical structure of the system? And the thought occurred to me that I'm a living testimony to the tolerance of the system, the fact that I've spoken out as bitterly as I have for 13 years and they have not run my car off the road. I note, for example, that the CIA in the books that they print, the polished books that they send to university campuses to professors around the U.S., in the back they have dissenting views and they recommend that people read my books. They say this is a man who worked for us who came to different conclusions. And I debated CIA directors, Bill Colby and Stansfield Turner. And although I felt like I had my facts together better and I held a moral ground and I presented my facts with a great deal of passion, they responded to me with greater respect and dignity than I did to them. And it's an irony, I would think, that although I may have been morally correct, people in the audience could have seen them as being nicer people than me. We've got to understand that the process of democracy, such as it is in the United States, means there's nowhere to go. We're stuck here together on this planet in our separate countries. We've got to dialogue with each other. We've got to debate. We've got to discuss things. And it's not talking about whether or not we're going to have the parade Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon. We're debating, intelligent, conscientious people. We're debating about whether we should have war, whether we should kill people, whether we should have an arms race, abortion, exploitation of the environment. If the U.S. goes to war against Cuba or otherwise brutalizes that country, if we spend another $1.5 trillion wastefully on arms instead of other things, it means that people like me, we have not made our case as well. We haven't used the system as well to reach enough people with our arguments as the other people have. I close lectures by urging people not to wait until you're done by the politicians. Get out and get to work on this thing. It is our world. These are our countries too, as well as theirs. We do have a say. We can make a difference. The reason the senators voted on Clarence Thomas the other day was because the polls showed 63% of the people favored him and his arguments over Anita Hill's charges. It could have been the other way around. You've got to read, you've got to inform yourself, you've got to get involved. You may have to unplug your television set with a pair of pliers and get your mind out involved in the world. I ask people, we all say it's the fault of the media. The media, biases things, and yet I'll shock you with one little detail. Everything I have said tonight has appeared in the major media, in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Not necessarily big headlines, but it's there. It is being reported. Every one of these shocking details is available. And yet, I don't know about up here in Canada, but I know in audiences in the US, I ask people, how many people in the audience know your representative's name and how he or she voted on the last 20 bills and what those bills are all about? And rarely I'll find one person who can raise their hand and say, yes, I know that. And then they say, however, we do, you see, that the Congress, the lobby groups, the special interest groups have an undue bias and the Congress responds to them. Well, the lobby groups are there, putting pressure on them. They know the bills. They're saying, vote on this bill, and putting pressure on them. We don't even know what the bills are. We don't care. And then we complain afterwards that they are selling out our country. We are selling out our country. We are selling out our world by apathy and by non-involvement. President Eisenhower left office with a famous speech in which he said, the people of the world genuinely want peace. Someday the leaders of the world are going to have to give in and give it to them. And I say, now is that time, and I thank you for hearing me out. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The question I'd like to ask relates to the upcoming so-called peace conference on the Middle East. What do you anticipate will be the outcome in terms of the struggle of the Palestinian people for self-determination and statehood?
I don't have any brilliant answer to that question. I don't think anyone does. I don't expect, I haven't seen any currents or hints of a brilliant breakthrough type of solution. It seems like these peace talks may or may not make conditions a little better, but they'll get buried in detail. I see these talks as the energy coming from President Bush, Secretary of State James Baker. They had a Persian Gulf War that, albeit showy and popular, had a kind of a muddy ending, a not satisfying ending. And they need a device that they can point to and say, look, we fought a war and we brought peace to the region. They didn't. They left Saddam Hussein in power with his army, and they've billions of dollars of arms are being poured into the area. But I think they need at least peace talks so they can talk peace. I may be missing something altogether, but I don't see anything dramatic coming out of it. I just don't. Alas. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Can you tell us about any covert or uninvited interference by the American government into Canadian affairs? I thought you hinted on it during your talk.
Hold on just a second.
Did you?
Do I hear a radio in the background? Our technician, excuse me. We've got some radio program on the speakerphone. Do you know how to, where that's coming from? This inhibits the, if we can find it, it would make a better quality.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
In that case, you're gonna, for me just to understand it, you're gonna have to speak very clearly.
Okay. I thought you hinted during your talk that the American government had some operations, uninvited or covert, in Canadian affairs. Can you expand on that?
Operations in Canada, the policy, and it was no smoke, the internal policy in the CIA when I was in, which is a number of years ago, was no operations in Canada without the specific approval of the Director of Operations, very high office, and the Chief of Station in Canada, who would mention it to the Canadian counterparts. And they were vigorous and firm about it. Now, I'm sure in the CIA there have always been exceptions endlessly to every rule, but that was the firm rule and we didn't mess with it. I had to come up one time to run, just to make contact with someone who happened to be living here, and I had to go through quite an elaborate process. At the same time, it may be somewhat of an indictment of Canadian authorities that CIA drug disease experimentation programs in the MK Ultra program were run up here as well as at universities in the United States, McGill University specifically. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this one. In 1988, the CIA settled with the victims out of court. The amount was announced, but not the names of the victims. The CIA had years previously been working with a mad psychiatrist who would take the people who came to him for help and hit them with LSD and other things to record their reactions for the CIA. And that was exposed and that was settled. How many others such operations, were run that we don't know about? God can only, we can only guess. This is a situation where I do not see the CIA having run a lot of vicious operations in Canada, or even a lot of operations in Canada. In many situations, like the Vietnam War, Canada has taken what would seem to me to be a noble position, sometimes to the irritation of the United States. In other cases, Canada, especially in the 80s, in getting this pendulum over here and welding it shut. Ronald Reagan had the cooperation of certain parties in Canada, and of course Margaret Thatcher in England. And it seems to me a tragedy. I regretted seeing that. It always helped us down there to see that in this hemisphere at least there was one more civilized country with more human values and more restraint on the subject of war and whatnot. But let there be no doubt at all, everything I've been talking about tonight in terms of the New World Order and the future, we got a common cause here. If the U.S. plunges into hyperinflation, Canada, especially with this free trade agreement, which doesn't seem to me to be very free, if you're a Canadian, it seems like you're going to pay for this thing a lot. You're definitely going to be pulled down as the U.S. goes down, or whatever happens in the big debt and deficit problem. Yes, sir.
Yes, good evening. My name is... This must be a CIUT microphone, no?
My name is... The CI technology would be better.
My name is Bruce Cattle. I do a show called Caffeine Free on CIUT. And I liked what you were saying about empowering people to get out and get to work on these issues. Don't wait until we're done. And one of the ways that some people here in Toronto are organizing and attempting to empower people is to organize a boycott around General Electric. And General Electric as our brothers and sisters who are organizing around this issue in the United States inform us, are the #1 American company complicit in the nuclear weapons industry. And this is not a, you know, it's multinational, it's transnational, etc., but it's still based in the United States. Over 4 million United States residents have signed up with the In Fact boycott, and we're about to launch a General Electric campaign here in Toronto. Before I ask you your question, Mr. Stockwell, I just want to briefly announce that we will be meeting tomorrow evening at the Queen West United Church. That's here in Toronto at 761 Queen Street West, and that will be at 7:30 p.m. Mr. Stockwell, I'd like to ask you a question about General Electric and boycotts and the effectiveness of boycotts. I'm told that General Electric has stopped producing the pins for nuclear missiles that they have been producing. Now, I'm not sure whether this is an effective result of the boycott, or else they've just stopped producing pins and they're still producing a lot of stuff for war. Could you just comment about boycotts and how effective they can be?
Tough question. I can think of, the Nestle's thing in Africa. I spent 15 years in Africa, so that one's dear to my heart, the infant mortality thing. And we got the world out, and people were holding Nestle's accountable, and they promised changes in the policies and seemed to effect changes, and that was very exciting. Although I understand that after world attention faded away, they'd gone back to similar policies. I think the civil rights movement, this jumps to mind in the South. The civil rights activists, the blacks, had tried a long time to effect changes and had not had any great success, and they began boycotting the stores in the Deep South and began to get serious concessions that led very directly to and part of the civil rights movement. I don't know if it's possible to organize a strong enough boycott of General Electric, which produces huge systems that deals with the government, that makes such tons of money from the government, to put effective pressure on them, but it might very well.
I just want to say that we thought we'd give you some music for a little bit of environmental sound, feeling here. We're working on the problem. I apologize for it. It seems to be quite innate and imbibed in the system. We're working on it. Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
I can sympathize with your son. I have children too, and they also want to live. But I work with refugees that come from many parts of the world that have received the bombs. And I have a lot of trouble with your use of the word nice people. I don't find them to be nice. I think they've compartmentalized their lives in such a way that they can have a nice appearance on the outside. And in the other compartment, it's all right to kill. It's okay to torture. It's okay to take what we want and let the others live in the poverty. And you quoted Eisenhower quite often. Eisenhower also said that every weapon that is built is bread stolen from the poor. And now that all these weapons are going to be dismantled, I was in New York when President Bush announced this, and I was full of rage at the magnanimous way in which he presented. I am going to do this. Why were they ever built? When is there going to be some lawyers in the United States that are going to take the whole government to court for stealing from the rest of the world? When is something going to be done that will at least show that we are interested in justice to those that are dying in so many parts of the world? And so getting back to your son, yes, I can understand that you have to review what you're saying so that you're not in a negative cesspool. But if we're going to give our children a holistic understanding of life and not allow them to compartmentalize themselves. We've got to do something about a government that has taken into their hands the right to kill from hunger many, many millions more, other than those that have been killed by the bombs. And I would like you to think maybe for your next book to write a court challenge to the government of the United States.
I'm not an attorney. I'm not qualified to bring things into court. I have written, I have traveled, I have lectured until my voice broke. I've pushed this cause until I spent 2 summers ago seriously plotting my own suicide. And that's the point at which my son intervened and my brother and said, that's not a solution. Now, when I said, nice people, it's trying to make a point. And this is a point, as I said, dealing with these people, if they were 9 feet tall with platinum teeth, there wouldn't be a problem. The media working with them sees them, they live with them, they go to church with them, they live neighbors, and they are viscerally nice people. George Bush is viscerally a nice person. I would hope that everyone drew from my lecture the importance of us finding a way to communicate to George Bush so that he feels responsible for what he's doing. Now, this is a tough one because people adapt so easily to systems of every kind, and throughout much of history, it's been okay for the nobility and the ultra-rich to live well while the poor starved right before their eyes. And this is what's happening now, and it's what's continuing to happen. And the killing and the suffering. It's a very important point that I'm struggling with. I shut down lecturing for 6 months. I thought about shutting down lecturing for a longer period of time. How can we grasp positive energy? I do not believe we're going to save the world by dropping out, by going on drugs, as so many people in the peace movement do and drop out, by rendering ourselves inarticulate with rage. Let me give you an example. I'm not sure we're going to stop it altogether the other way, but let me give you quickly another example. My war in Angola. Mind you, I was the General Schwarzkopf of a very tiny little secret complicated war in Angola. I was the commander. And my war was stopped by a young professor at UC San Diego who had studied Angola, and he saw what we were doing. And he tried this and he tried that, and nothing seemed to work. And so he picked up the phone one day and called Senator Tunney in Southern California and said, Senator, I believe the CIA is doing something in Angola. I believe they're lying to you. I would like to brief you. I'll be brief. I won't waste your time. And he went and spoke with the senator for 2 hours. I got this from the senator after my book came out. And Tunney went back to Washington and investigated and found it was true and introduced the Tunney Amendment to the FY 76 Defense Appropriation Bill that stopped my war in Angola. Now, if Jerry Bender had screamed and thrown a brick and insulted Tunney and raged at him, my war wouldn't have been stopped. He found in that particular case the proper way to dialogue and reach someone involved in the system, and he stopped a war. Now, there's a lot of inspiration in that. Of course, we lose a lot of rounds. Mind you, George Kennan provided, again, the rationales back in 45. Eventually, it's going to be us against the third world. And this is what they're operating on. This is their coda, if you will, their attitude and policies towards the third world. It's formal insensitivity. And that's just a word. And if you've been down to Nicaragua, as I have, 10 times during the horror there, and to the other countries and places I've traveled to, it tears your heart out. And then you come back and try to find the most effective way to scream. I protested the Persian Gulf War. I lectured and spoke out and wrote a book, The Praetorian Guard, to try to be. I refused to wear the yellow ribbons that the peace movement generated initially and the whole nation caught on, meaning I support the troops, not the war necessarily, but the troops. I said if somebody would come up with a green ribbon supporting all the troops, including the Iraqi troops that were dying in that conflict and the civilians and everyone else, I would wear that one. It's a tough, complex problem, and the question is finding out how to scream more effectively and what your tolerance of all this is. And when you lose one, as we do so often, as we will continue to, how to pick up again the next day and go right on struggling for more change on the next issue and the next issue and the next issue and the next issue. That's what I'm begging you to do.
On the CIA drug connection, is there anything that could be done with that?
Well, people were writing again in '87 that if he didn't make it into the presidency, he might find himself investigated and possibly prosecuted, depending on what they could find. It would seem to me the linkage is very clear. It seemed to me that the Congress and the American people were extremely forgiving in Iran-Contra. Felix Rodriguez was reporting directly to George Bush's office, to Don Gregg, who was Bush's national security advisor. Don Gregg was an ex-CIA man, as was George Bush. We know this because we have the commercial telephone calls. They were telephoning constantly. And Rodriguez flew up there to see them 3 times, had lunch with Bush himself. Bush's denial was that, well, they talked about the weather. He didn't remember talking. They didn't talk about the Contra program. But, you know, this is pretty forgiving to let that go because Felix Rodriguez was named in the Millán Rodriguez trial in which the documentation was brought out that Millán had laundered money for the Medellin drug cartel and donated $10 million to the Contra program through Felix Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez also admitted publicly that they got Luis Posada Carillas out of prison in Venezuela because they, quote, needed him in the program, and he was being held for having bombed a passenger plane from the sky in Barbados, I believe on October 26 of 1976, an airplane bomber, a terrorist. And he was gotten out of prison by Felix Rodriguez, who was reporting directly to Vice President George Bush's office. Now, had George Bush purged himself of those associations when that information was brought out, it might have been forgivable. But he denied knowledge, but he retained contact and cordial relations with these people and appointed Don Gregg, I believe, as ambassador to Korea. And this, to me, were I in a position to make a decision, would be to say, you know, sorry, babe, you're not qualified to run for the president because that's just too murky.
Thank you very much.
This is the one with the radio. Mr. Stockwell, I've had the opportunity to listen to you a number of times, both in the States and in Canada, and I just want to say that while I enjoy them, they seem to be very much the same a lot of the time. I was wondering if you could elaborate. A lot of lecturers talk about the church hearings. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the laws that have come out since the church hearings, namely under the Reagan Bush administration, that have more or less reversed the intent of the hearings. And also on the fact that, or the point that you mentioned about the fact that we all live in a democratic society, and that's maybe why, the fact that you haven't been killed or taken out yet is testament to that. You come from Texas, I think, I remember, and you are a white male. Most of this audience is white, and what you're preaching is more or less go out and learn And society, and North American society, has proven that it's apathetic, and that no matter what level of learning we do, we're not going to really do much about it. So I just would like you to kind of consider some of those points, and consider the way that the Black Panthers and AIM and the Puerto Rican movement, as the person before me mentioned, I don't think that they would agree that we live in a democratic society, and I don't. And I don't think...
If I may, because you're going from point to point, and I'm going to forget, and not be able to answer all your points. Remember, let me, and then you can go on. Remember, I said a democratic society such as it is. Now, in speeding along through this, I've always pointed out that the U.S. is not a democracy. It never has been. It's a republic. It's a modified form of democracy at best. I also point out, when I have enough time, to again read Howard Zinn, the principle that there's one party with two chapters. That's right. And the establishment controls by bouncing back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans. Your point that you've heard me speak several times, and some of it is repetitive, this bothers me not because you said it, but in every lecture I have to decide which lecture to give according to the audience of the ones I give, and I have one that is clearly much stronger than others, and I can only apologize to you if you've heard me 6 times before and heard some of the material. But this is the best shot I can take, is the one I gave tonight, I believe, in what I had to say. If you want to have me back next week, clearly to the same audience...
Yeah, I think we would like that.
I will, give you a different rap if you want to bring me right back. Now, on the other one, again, I will not let you infer insensitivity on my part to the minorities in any form. Let me elaborate. I grew up in Africa with my mother raising Congolese orphans who were my brothers, bilingual, bicultural with these people. One of my great-great-grandmothers was a Cherokee Indian with African-American blood, and when I was a boy, I thought that was neat. I've walked, I've marched, I've protested, I've slept on couches, I've gone long years in which I was not home but maybe 3 days a month, speaking out, trying to heighten the sensitivity in the United States especially to the way the minorities in that country and the people in other countries are brutally abused. So don't make any inference there that really is unfair.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah. My apologies for that. I think it's important to realize that when we, especially as white people, say that we're free to go around and talk about this and do all this because we live in this democratic and free society with all of these freedoms, that there's a lot of people in this very society that that don't feel that and haven't been able to live that.
I've also pointed out about 400 times out of 600 lectures, when people ask, how come you're still alive, I've pointed out that I'm a blue-eyed WASP ex-colonel from the middle of the establishment, and when I went public, I did it the proper way of testifying to the Congress and going on 60 Minutes and writing a book. And I've always pointed out that I'm not a black activist from Houston or Chicano activists from Austin, where you can see them sometimes on television getting their skulls cracked and getting killed. The society definitely, had I been of a minority doing what I'm doing, I might very well not be here today.
I just want to get my question in here.
Yes.
Thank you for that. When George Bush was head of the CIA, and I believe it was 1977, he oversaw the overthrow of the Whitlam government in Australia, and at the same time, or shortly thereafter, there was the, I don't remember the name of the bank, but the whole banking scandal in Australia, the biggest one that country's ever seen, on the comparable to what, the SNL and the BCC crisis in the States. With all of that, the events before that and events after that, Peter Dale Scott was recently speaking, and he said that to the effect of all of his books has been nil. And coming back to the point that is just exposing this information and learning about it, is that enough? And finally, you spoke about reject illegal activity. I would like your opinion on how you feel about civil disobedience, armed struggle, and finally, if you've ever been arrested for civil disobedience.
I have been arrested in civil disobedience. I know Peter well. There are quite a few people who are speaking out and writing whose research is not careful, and I'm being kind in saying it that way. And they publish stuff that is either visibly not true or is later exposed to be untrue, and that costs the credibility of everybody who's working very hard to get. If we hold the moral high ground, I believe sincerely, and we also can hold the intellectual high ground, I believe the facts and the truth make our case. And I get quite irritated when I see people taking cheap shots because they say we're on the side of the angels, so it doesn't matter whether or not what we're saying is true. Because there are a lot of people in the middle who are going to hear us, and then it's proven untrue, and they're just going to write us off. Peter is a friend of mine, and I read his stuff carefully. There are others publishing whose stuff I don't read because I've just seen too much of it was full of smoke. But it's true, what he's saying. I mean, the books he writes and books like the Praetorian Guard, the Guard, we're going to sell, well, at least 14,000 copies, which is not bad. But, you know, there are 250 million people in the country. I mean, it's not a big factor. And Peter's books sell about like that. But I still do, I'm more optimistic than he if he really said that, because although we haven't had the damn break with the weight of our energy, my bibliography, my library, which is several thousand books now, and virtually all of them, like all but 3 or 4, were written since the mid-70s. There is a great eruption of information and awareness that people didn't have in my generation, joining the CIA, joining the Marine Corps, going to war in Vietnam. It hasn't been enough, again, to turn the tide totally, but I watch the shows and I watch the establishment mouthing my lines and Peter's lines now, and I take heart. Now, it's wishful. I mean, a little bit, you know, it's like the football team that's down 4 touchdowns, and, you know, but you threw a pass and it connected, so we're going to try harder because we can do it. But we have to keep trying because of the importance of what's at stake. This I just so strongly believe.
Mr. Stockwell, it's a good thing that you are here. I admire your courage. During your discourse, you mentioned an interesting scenario of a well-known Christian evangelist dining with a man with his finger on the button. And his belief would seem to be he's longing for the end of the earth, the destruction of the earth, so that he will be sooner in heaven. In the history book that I read, it says that destruction comes upon those who would destroy the earth. Adolf Hitler wined and dined with the Vatican and had their blessings. He also was a man of God. My history book describes these holy people as a whore, an apostate. We have many history books. Which do we believe? There was a man who came to testify of the truth, And he said, "If you believe in me, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." My history book is over 3,500 years old. Which history book shall we believe?
Next question.
Okay, am I on again? Wow, no radio. Okay, I just George Bush used to work for Dan Quayle for the Eli Lilly Co. I just wanted to give that as a bit of trivia. Question I wanted to ask.
Wait
sorry,
a minute. Repeat that?
Oh, sorry. I just threw that in as a bit of trivia. If you don't know that, you might want to know. When George Bush was ostensibly out of power during the Carter administration, I've read that he worked for the Eli Lilly Corporation, which is owned either by the father or the uncle of Dan Quayle, and I just think that's a really interesting connection. Anyway, my question. Pardon me?
I would suggest you research that more carefully before you say it in public again, because Bush had his own independent wealth. I believe he was CI director during the Carter administration. I don't believe he was hanging around out of power, not pursuing his career. It doesn't ring plausible to me. I would suggest you research that.
Okay, sorry.
Before you throw it out again, and go ahead with your question.
Okay, sorry. It's just a case of believing something I read.
Yeah, he's a very powerful man at that time, with his career going with definite presidential ambitions, and I can't see him off working for Dan Quayle at that time. I don't believe that. Excuse me.
Okay. I've sort of got two questions, mine and the guy behind me, since he's been cut off, if you have time for both. My question, and I'm sort of amazed that no one has asked this before, you very quickly made the assertion that Cuba is going to be invaded sometime in the next 6 to 9 months. Now, I am an activist, and I've worked largely in peace issues before, and one thing that's true is that you need a few more facts other than just the United States is going to invade Cuba to sway people. I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about that. And the other question, which is sort of paraphrasing the other person's question behind me, is do you have any comment on the groups which seem to be getting some predominance, which are to the right of, say, the conservatives in this country, you know, the Reform Party in this country, or, say, the groups that seem to be quite to the right of the Republican Party, and that, you know, if you want to say David Duke or whoever, who is getting some ascendancy in the United States? Thanks.
Yes, I did not say that the U.S. is definitely going to invade Cuba. I said if we don't do our job. I see all the ingredients as I predicted the other invasions. You know, the equation is there, and it equals possibly an invasion of Cuba if George Bush is in trouble in the '92 elections, and it looks like he is worried very much about being in trouble. I said they are definitely going to do Cuba, but that may very well be just helping Cuba to collapse as it loses Soviet support, in which case they will do it in the sense of having these people in Florida, some of whom lived there before, or their parents lived there before Fidel, who are already, I mean, a year and a half ago, they were having meetings in which they were planning, open meetings. People go and tape record them. You could listen to the tapes where they were discussing the instant reorganization of Cuba when Fidel falls. And there were articles in the East Coast papers of bankers, people with businesses in Florida, selling them to amass capital so they can hit Havana ready to go to work, starting the Chevrolet agency, instant wealth, buying this building, hitting the ground running to instantly be among the new owners in Cuba. Organizing in some detail, they're plotting ahead, and they're saying it's coming out all over the place 6 months. which, would be next spring, and, that could stretch a couple of months. It could be that in addition to those people wanting to go back to Cuba, it could be that the Bush administration would see it advantageous to orchestrate public opinion to an invasion, to bombing, to physically subduing Fidel, if he's still holding together and still defiant, so they can get this feel-good effect that Americans respond to help him win the '92 election. It may not work that way, however. I do not believe, Fidel it appears to me to be vastly more intelligent and shrewder than Saddam Hussein, closer in over here, playing politics smarter, working the United Nations better. I don't believe the United Nations would vote a bill to approve the U.S. bombing of Cuba back to the Stone Age. I think the U.S. would have trouble selling it at that level. That wouldn't necessarily stop them. They didn't have that in Panama or Grenada or Libya or other wars they fought. So it wouldn't necessarily stop them, but it would be harder to sell. It just seems to me that we are facing the end of Fidel's time in Cuba, the 30 years, the remarkable life he's led, the remarkable influence he's had from a small country on world events, the experiment of his revolution. The world has changed out from under him. The people who are drawn to what he's done will argue that it wasn't a fair test because the U.S. has blockaded and embargoed over the years so that Cuba had economic problems that were artificial, that we've maintained a state of war against him. It wasn't a test of the system at all. He has visibly, I have been down there and looked carefully myself, he has visibly, the shantyvilles that much of the population lived in, massive house building programs. You drive for it seems like miles in East Havana of new high-rise apartment buildings that he's built, and the shantyvilles don't exist. Schools. The countries I've lived in for 17 years in the third world were barefoot kids, a lot of them out of school. The Cuban kids all in schools with shoes on, maybe rough shoes and little uniforms, but nevertheless definitely in school. Jobs for a high percentage of the people, medical care for everybody there. It seems like these are examples that we can learn from. A higher literacy rate, I believe, than the United States itself. Better infant mortality. Better infant mortality figures than Washington, the United States capital itself. These are all remarkable pluses. At the same time, they've paid a price for these pluses that a lot of people in the U.S. and Canada would have trouble accepting. There is no alternative press. And I mean like the difference between the Washington Post and the New York Times, there's the government press. They do have, and it is growing now as times are getting tighter, repression, mind police. A big industry is tourism, and you're not allowed to talk to the tourists, and if you do, you get called in and questioned. What is all this, fraternizing with the tourists and whatnot? I'm sorry, but I believe it's a true statement that if many people from the U.S. peace movement or progressive movement, whatever you want to call it, went down to try to live in Cuba, they would wind up very quickly siding with the students and the people who are trying to do underground newspapers and things just instinctively, rather than with Fidel and his party. There is an elitist factor in the party, and there is a mentality of repression, and just even with the schools and whatnot, it would be hard for a lot of people I know to live there. Beyond all that, though, I see in the U.S., as I try to talk about this, sometimes some of the diehards will jump up, and I'm calling for whatever my, half 1 cent is worth, for Fidel to reverse his policies and take a measure from perhaps Gorbachev and try to work with the United States in a solution. Now, what scares me, he's not the kind of personality that can compromise much by nature. And what scares me, if he doesn't, now he has a lot of popularity and a lot of influence. It seems to me, subject to everybody's disagreement, that he could use his influence to cut a deal for a transformation government. His era has come to an end, the Che revolutionary era. The world has changed. It seems like he could cut a deal so that Cuba would change peacefully in a transition way, in a constructive way, where people he has trained and people who've grown up working with him and supporting him, members of his party, would have a role to play. Well-educated people would have a role to play in the new society. If he is terminally defiant and goes down in violence, then we're going to have instant death squads and purges of those people, and he will have less of an imprint on the future of Cuba, it seems to me, and more people will suffer and perhaps die in the process, maybe thousands and thousands of people. This is my concern. I see a conflict coming one way or the other that could be very, very dangerous to the Cuban people with long-term repercussions. We could have an instant El Salvador on our hands. And my heart cries out for the two leaders to sit down and agree to work this out so that whatever, as the world turns, there'll be a peaceful transition and not a horrible one. Well, this question is a fair question, and not to dwell too long on this, but it is important. This may be the next big conflict. Didn't Fidel already try that? And I would say, yes, Fidel has worked hard. There have been lots of feelers from the Cubans that trying to establish relations with the U.S. This is the thrust of Wayne Smith's book, Closest of Enemies, I believe it's called. He spent his entire career in the State Department working in Cuba. He was a young officer on his first assignment when Fidel came out of the mountains. He was the head of the U.S. Interest Section there in 1982 and resigned in protest of the exaggerations of Reagan's policies towards Cuba and Central America. And he has worked valiantly, and in his book and in his teachings, this is a man with a PhD from Johns Hopkins, and a very impressive man, working very hard, saying Cuba has always been willing to settle the differences, and the U.S. has been essentially intransigent, and we should work it out with them. Fidel has nevertheless, in his efforts to work it out, he's taken the position of, well, we're equals. We're going to sit down and work this out, and you're going to concede, and we're going to concede. And the balance of power, the reality, the real politic, doesn't work that way. The U.S. doesn't need this deal as much as he does. But, what I'm saying is Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union so desperately needed change, he made the U.S. look bad just by his sheer generosity. He blew over ego and said, yes, blow it off. We got to change this system. We got to stop huffing and puffing at each other and take a quantum leap forward. And this is what Fidel has to do. God knows I wish Bush would do that too. And I've certainly said so in all of my lectures. I would rather see Fidel step aside than see 50,000 Cubans die. If you read Peter Bourne's book, which I highly recommend, titled Fidel, he was Jimmy Carter's doctor, I believe, a doctor of psychiatry,
but worked in the White House and practices medicine, and he wrote in lay terms a profile, a biography of Fidel. And he makes it very clear that from his youth, Fidel had a martyr complex. He put himself in situation after situation, defiant, totally defiant, that he did not expect to survive. And miraculously, he did time and time again. He expected to be one of Cuba's great martyrs. When he found himself in power suddenly in Havana, he had no agenda whatsoever for running a country. All he had was an agenda for fighting and glorious battle and things. And he went into a state of depression and great confusion. And it took him quite a while to get organized and flounder around and eventually emerge with a government and emerge with a new system. Now, last spring, he gave a speech in which he said, he always his long speeches, instead of fatherland or death, the way he usually closes his speeches, he said Marxism, Leninism, or death. And this makes me very uncomfortable. He has a martyr complex, obviously. He's willing, and no question of his courage, to die, now as an old man, fighting to the death. But is Marxism, Leninism in today's world, with the Soviet Union having collapsed, with the world changed this much, worth Cuba fighting, to the bloody end? I mean, I'm sure he would have 1 million Cubans die in the last great battle. And I just disagree. I would rather see, I think Fidel has a chance to go down in history as a brilliant figure, and in the end, a brilliant statesman working out a pragmatic deal, the best deal he can for the future of Cuba, to preserve as many of his principles and institutions as he can, or to go down as a terminally defiant anachronism, martyr, with a minimum long-term impact. And I think that it would take a big gesture from him to do it. And let it be very clear that I am continuing my lectures and trying to make people aware of the danger, hoping that moderate forces and factors in the U.S. Will restrain the people in my government and my own president who might want to do it even more violently and take Cuba back. It will, as I put it in another lecture, I have a lump of horror in my stomach. What might happen if we can't get one or both of these two leaders to find a more humane way for history to evolve vis-a-vis Cuba. Thank you.
Stockwell. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for taking time to come to Toronto.